Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here for episode number 149. I'm glad that some of you are tuning in and listening again. I'm trying to make this newly relaunched podcast be of usefulness, but also to talk about just some of the spiritual issues that I think are relevant right now in our world. I feel like we're at a time of deep unrest occurring, but it's also a transitional time, and it may feel like everything is falling apart right now, but I believe that is because we are on our way toward a bigger transformation that's going to be happening in the future. We're just in the middle of it all, and so this is a time of a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, and also a lot of angst and fear about what's going to happen next. And really, during times like this, the most important thing we can each do is work on ourselves, our inner journeys, like I've talked about before, and take a look at who am I, what do I value, how am I showing up in the world. And when you see gaps within yourself, like, wow, I value this, but I don't really behave that way in the world, that's a sign that you need to do work on yourself. And as much as we want to be activists and we want to go out in the world and make change there, which we should do, the world needs us to do that, we have to make change from our most integrated selves. And when I say integration, I mean bringing together all the parts of ourselves, our lower consciousness and higher consciousness, so that we can go out into the world with as much integrity as possible and as whole as we can possibly be. So again, it takes inner work. We have to be willing to look at ourselves, look at our wounds, look at our values, look at how we actually show up and behave in the world, and be honest about our interactions with other people and the way we respond to things and react. And so one of the most important things I believe that we can do is to come to terms with our own ego. And this episode today is the beginning of a 3-part series I'm going to do. The series is called From Ego-Driven to Soul-Led, A Journey of Integration. And today we're starting by talking about the ego, what the ego is and why we need it. This is material that comes from my book, The Journey from Ego to Soul. And I'm going to be doing a presentation on this very topic in October for the Scientific and Medical Network, which will be online. I will eventually be letting you know when and where and how to register if you're interested in that. But you're going to get the information right here, and beginning today talking about the ego. And so again, it's just so important that we get to know our own ego, that we understand the shape of our ego, how it operates within us, and how it has been wounded, because I guarantee you it has. And when we're carrying deep ego wounds, they get shielded from our awareness a lot of times. They get buried sometimes. And it's really important that we be able to look deeper within and recognize, no one has had an absolutely perfect childhood or perfect life. And so be honest and be willing to take a look and be humble and admit where woundedness may reside within you, because that's the way we become more integrated. And one of the things that was just occurring to me this week is, if we want to do something about violence in our world, about war in our world, we first have to heal the violence and the war that exists within us. And sometimes the violence that's within us is actually hidden. Sometimes it's been repressed. It's caged up. It's hidden away inside of us. And yet it is still a negative force in our lives that is taking our energy away and sucking sucking creativity and energy from us, which makes us less able to be out in the world, bringing good to the world, kindness and love. So again, take a look at whatever violence or war or hatred resides deep down in the shadow in yourself. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ego, as I said. What is it? Why do we need it? And how can we relate to it with compassion rather than judgment? And again, in the arc of this 3-part series, we're going to start with the ego. We're going to talk about what it means to be soul-led, and also how grief often serves as a bridge between these two states of being. So that is one of the themes of this particular series. So we're going to move first into the ego and begin by talking about what is the ego really. We may know that it's part of our psyche, part of our personality. And oftentimes we hear the ego talk about, especially in spiritual circles, as we become a little higher in consciousness, we hear things like destroy the ego, kill the ego, and a lot of negativity about the ego. But it's important that we understand how the ego functions and how it also serves us, because the ego isn't really a villain. It's a very important and necessary part of being human. And it starts forming in our early childhood. And it's really an adaptive mechanism that helps us survive. So our ego is developing around the age of 2 or 3. And I have a granddaughter who's right at that age right now, and I get to watch it every time I'm with her. I get to see her little ego taking shape. It creates her sense of self, of who she is, of how she fits into the world, and also what she needs to do to feel safe and loved in the world. That is an important factor, because the ego allows us to change our behavior and how we show up in order to guarantee safety, in order to try to buy a sense of being loved. And this is crucial to know about yourself and your own childhood. So the ego is our first recognition, our first dawning that we are a separate self in many ways. Though, see, on the spiritual journey, we're all working on how do we get past the separate self and recognize that we're connected to everyone. But we have to distinguish ourselves as separate first in order to have a self to transcend, to connect with everyone. And so this part of our journey of developing the ego and strengthening it to a certain extent, but also helping it be as healthy as possible, is crucial before we can get to that inward arc, the higher state of consciousness, where we actually transcend the sense of being separate. So the ego grows and evolves during these early years of our lives, and the ego learns from our parents and from the adults in our lives. How do they correct us? How do they encourage us? How do they praise us or show love to us? How do they reject us? When do they seem embarrassed by us or feel shame toward us? Or when do they get angry at us? That is how the ego is constantly sensing and taking in cues from the adults during childhood to know, how should I be? How should I behave? What's okay or not okay? And also, what impulses do I have? And how do I manage those impulses? So the ego is the part of us that says, this is who I am. It creates our sense of self and identity so that we can operate in the world. And the ego also helps us find structure and keep ourselves safe. It's our ego that warns us when danger is around. And the ego also makes sense of the day-to-day experiences we have in life. And in some ways, the ego is like the scaffolding of the self, the inner framework in our ideas and our thoughts of who we are. And it's important that we have the ego because it allows us to function in the world. If we don't have a sense of who we are, if we don't have a sense of our place here in the world, it's very hard to go out and interact and do the things we need to do on a day-to-day basis to get jobs, to make money, to interact with other people, even to shop at the grocery store, if we don't have some sense of who we are as a self and as a unique self. And as I said initially, a separate self. It's only after we establish that separate self that we can go on to rise above it and transcend it. So the ego gives us our unique personality, our voice, our perspective on life and the world. And it's really through the ego, particularly early in life, that we relate to other people and connect to other people. But the most important job of the ego, and this is, it's essential that we understand this, is protection. The ego's real job is to keep us safe. And the ego, therefore, is the home of fear, the fear that we feel inside, because that's the tool the ego uses to warn us that when things don't seem safe or don't feel safe. And the ego is also really operates through the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response that we hear about all the time, that raises our heart rate and our blood pressure so that we can react when we are in a place of danger, when we sense danger. And this is actually really important because we do need to be able to recognize when legitimate danger exists around us, and we need to be able to gear up our bodies to respond to that danger, to run away or to stay and fight, whatever it takes for our survival. But the ego is particularly sensitive to our thoughts and our worries. And because it's designed to protect us, it tends to view life through a lens of fear. The ego kind of leads with fear and steps out there suspicious, worried, concerned about everything in life around us. It is constantly scanning for threats in the world, whether those threats are real or just perceived. And again, if we have limiting beliefs and a thought pattern that continually ruminates and brings up potential worries, the ego responds to that with even more fear and even more vigilance in the world to find out where is the danger, where's this coming from, and to also motivate us to try to keep ourselves safe. And in order to create safety, the ego needs to always be in control. So that's one of the other motivations of the ego, is how do I maintain control here? What's it going to take to stay in charge of what's happening and to always be in control? And the fear and the vigilance of the ego are not necessarily bad things, as I mentioned. They're important for us to be able to be aware of legitimate dangers, but the ego always tends to go overboard and to perceive danger where it may not exist, unless we train the ego and work on ourselves to kind of dampen down some of the instincts of the ego and some of the reactivity of the ego. Because the ego, again, it wants to be in charge of everything. It has a lens of fear and sees threats when they're not really there. The ego also constantly tells us stories. Things like, there's not enough here for everyone. I have to make sure I get mine first. The ego is also the part of us that is constantly making comparisons with other people, judging other people, trying to find justification for how right I am and why someone else is wrong. Often gets in conflicts with other people and argues with other people. And the ego is also the home of a lot of conflicting thoughts and ideas. Like, for one thing, I'm the best at this. I need to be in charge. I'm really good at this. While at the same time having an underlying belief that I'm not good enough at anything. I'm not enough. So the wounded ego tends to carry that belief, I'm not good enough. And sometimes the I'm better than everyone else aspect of the ego is a result of the underlying feeling of not being good enough. It is a defense mechanism to hide from the pain of not feeling good enough, which probably got started back in childhood. And ultimately, the ego is the part of us that holds our fear of death, because physical death, the death of the physical body, also results in the death of the ego. And the ego is terrified of not existing. So this deep-seated fear is behind all of the other little fears that take place in life, the ultimate fear of non-existence. And that for the ego is intolerable to contemplate and to experience, at least in the beginning. And so it's the part of us that carries fear in every situation that we're in. And once we acknowledge that and recognize it, we are able to work with it. We're able to manage the ego. We're able to adjust our thinking. We're able to see things from different perspectives, and we can actually help soothe and calm the fears of the ego through the inner work that we do. And that's why it's so important. If we don't recognize our own ego and how it operates, it will take control when we're not prepared for it. It may surprise us. We may find ourselves getting angry and losing control when we're with other people and having no idea why, like not even understanding where that came from. We may find that there are certain people we really dislike and we don't really know why, but it may be coming from the ego, which often gets triggered by other people for all of its various reasons, many times because of the wounds the ego is carrying. So I'm thinking back to early childhood. And remembering when I was 3 years old, the same age as my granddaughter, and I remember being a volatile, wild little girl who slammed doors and yelled about things, and I was defiant, which my parents did not like and didn't tolerate well. And so the message I got is that all of those feelings, those wild feelings I have inside of me are not okay. I have to shut them down. So for me personally, my journey with ego was that my ego had to be caged in many ways and made very small and very quiet because it got me in trouble all the time as a child. And so I learned how to be very cautious around what I ever experienced or acted upon in my life, any emotions that I acted upon, because of the fear of being rejected. So I'm just saying that's just one small example, but it's really important to look back at your own childhood, think about your parents and how they parented you. What messages did you get? Was your ego nurtured in a healthy way, your sense of self, of who you are, or were certain parts of you shut down and rejected, and were you told they were bad so that you had to lock them away? And all the behaviors of the ego have been, when they develop in childhood, it's always in service of our own safety and our own growth. It's just that when we become adults, some of those behaviors don't serve us well anymore, and they're things we need to recognize and learn about in order to move past. So if we don't evolve beyond the behaviors and the stories of the ego, we can end up staying stuck in fear-based patterns, constantly reacting, comparing, defending, or proving ourselves. And the ego is loud. The ego speaks and acts very loud inside of us. It does tend to take up the room when the ego has never been trained and we've never learned how to manage it. And for some people, don't even know there are other parts to themselves beyond ego. They live only from the ego, and it's all they know of who they are. Some people don't know that they have a higher self, a witnessing self that can step back and observe them And that witnessing self they can use to help them heal and learn and grow. But many people are not even aware that they have this witnessing self within them, the higher consciousness. So the ego is always trying to gain control. It's loud. It doesn't like being ignored. It's terrified of death and doesn't want to think about that or talk about it. It's defended against death. Also grief, because grief reminds the ego of death. And so our ego selves are not very well suited for operating in the world that we're living in today. And that's why we need to do this inner work and move beyond and develop our higher selves. But again, I want to emphasize that the ego is necessary and important. We need to know who we are before we can evolve beyond who we are, if you know what I mean. We need to know we're a separate self before we can evolve beyond it and recognize our connectedness to everyone. And I think the important thing to realize about the ego, I think of it as it's the vehicle in a way for our higher selves to move through the world. Without an ego, we wouldn't be able to connect with other people. I wouldn't be able to be sitting here doing a podcast. We wouldn't be able to go out and interact and have a job and be present in the world. We need a sense of ourselves as a self, and we need the ego to help us. It's our vehicle that the soul, the higher self, uses to maneuver through the world and to connect and be part of the world. It's essential. But the ego is a terrible driver. So we don't want the ego to drive the vehicle. We just want the ego to transport the higher consciousness that needs to interact with the world and be part of the world. When we as higher selves embody into a physical body, we embody into the mind and the ego as well. And so our higher consciousness takes on the ego as a partner in the world, and it's essential. But we have to learn how to empower our higher selves to be the guide and to instruct the ego and teach the ego what it needs to know. So remember that the ego gives us structure. It helps us navigate our roles and relationship in the world. It sets boundaries and it protects us when we're vulnerable. All essential, all very important parts of the ego. So I want to emphasize that we need to appreciate and be grateful for the egos that we have as we're studying them and learning about them. And to remember the problem is not that we have an ego. It's the problem occurs when we let the ego make the decisions, when the ego is allowed to drive the car without any supervision. And the ego can tend to rise up. There might be times when we're able to operate from our higher selves better than others, but when we're under stress, we may tend to regress. And that can happen when we're afraid, or if we're grieving and we've experienced loss, or if we're uncertain. And that's where we are right now in our world. We're all grieving. We're all a little bit afraid. We're all uncertain about where we're headed or what's going to happen next. So this is prime territory for the ego to rise up and say, here I am, I'll take charge, I'm in control. But the ego is not very well suited for these moments of crisis. It's there to help us. It's a partner. It's the vehicle, but we still need to learn how to utilize our higher selves to drive the car, so to speak, and to guide us through life in making decisions, making choices, in really planning out how we want to show up in the world. And there's one other aspect I want to point out about the ego, which has to do with this, the topic of developing as our higher consciousness. It's that when we first begin to evolve as a spiritual being and to look at spiritual practices like forgiveness and love, the ego may act out. The ego does not like to forgive. The ego sees no reason to forgive because that's like giving up control. That's like admitting that I'm not right. And the ego in its purest essence does not like that, does not want that. And that's where we have to use training for our ego in order to develop spiritual practices. And you'll find lots of people who live primarily from the ego who shun the idea of forgiveness, of love, of gratitude, of caring for others. And that's because the ego for them is in charge. That's all they know. And the ego dislikes that kind of behavior. It doesn't come naturally to the ego. The ego is all about how I protect me and my best interests and what suits me well. And look around our world. We see lots and lots of examples of people operating from that level, totally self-concerned and self-focused. So when we set out to do this kind of deeper soul work on ourselves, our own egos may protest a little bit. We may feel a certain amount of unease about doing this work. That may come up for us. But at a certain point, and I've experienced this myself and I've watched many other people experience it as well, the ego begins to catch on that, if I start to do this spiritual thing, that will actually make me better than a lot of other people. And we begin to develop what is called a spiritual ego, which means the ego itself, instead of rejecting some of these spiritual concepts, begins to try them on like a costume, like, oh, look, if I'm really nice, if I really say I care about other people and I want what's best for them, I look really good. I look good to other people, and I actually look like I'm better than other people are. And there is a phase in our spiritual development when the ego may be a little too involved in wearing the costume of spirituality and may make it appear like we're at a higher place of consciousness than we actually are, because the ego is just mimicking things that it's heard and seen from other people. And so we may go through a time when it feels like we're imposters, when it feels like I'm saying and doing certain things, but I don't honestly even believe that. And it may be that our spiritual ego is behind some of the changes that we really want to make on a deep level. But if they're coming too quickly and we're a little too glib about how, oh, look at me, I'm already enlightened, look at how evolved I am, it might be the ego wearing the costume of higher consciousness, and that we haven't genuinely finished all the work and gotten ourselves there. And so that's a little trap to beware of. Usually if we get caught up in it, it trips us up at some point, and we can feel quite humiliated when we recognize, like, oh, like I thought I had really made it. I thought I really was enlightened. And when we suddenly recognize, oh, wait, that was a little masquerade party the ego put on, attempting to pretend like we're more highly evolved than we are. And so sometimes the rug gets pulled out from under us a little bit, and we have to recognize that we are at a lower level than we thought we were. We still have more work to do. That is actually a normal and necessary part of this process. So be prepared for it. You may see it in yourself that there's this sudden change when the ego doesn't reject spiritual behaviors anymore. It actually tries to put them on and tries to pretend like it is spiritual. So beware of that within yourself if you see it. And in next week's episode, we're going to talk more about higher consciousness, how it behaves, how to recognize when you are genuinely operating from your higher consciousness, and to tell the difference between higher consciousness and spiritual ego. So I want to leave you with a little prompt today of something that you could reflect on during the week before we come back and talk about higher consciousness. Just to think about, when was a time that your ego tried to protect you? That comes to mind, something recent or something from the past, it doesn't matter. And Was your ego helpful? Was it really a time when you were under threat and when you needed the ego to step up and act? Or was the ego more of a limiting factor that actually prevented you from having a better experience that you might have had? So this is a great practice to be in. And I recommend as well, if you start journaling about the ego, one thing you can do is once a week or so, look back and think, how have things gone over the past week? Was there a time when I felt resentful towards someone else? Was there a time when I felt angry, or when I had a rather heated discussion with someone else? Or is there a time when I found myself judging someone and thinking, they're not very good. They're not very nice. And really stop and look at those times, because that is the ego that's operating in that way. That's part of how you get to know your own ego and where it shows up. And if you've been working on yourself for a long time, the ego can be rather cunning and it can hide itself pretty well. I remember I heard Ram Dass say, got to hear him speak at a conference, and he said the ego, it can disguise itself as anything, even emptiness, even the highest levels of enlightenment and higher consciousness. And so always be wary of the ego. Always know the ego is still in there. It doesn't go away. It just gets better and better at hiding. So it is really important for us to do this careful work, be willing to look at ourselves every week or so, look back and see, where were the problem spots this week, and how did my ego show up when I wasn't expecting it? So I encourage you to journal about that, and keep notes on it, because that's how you're going to get to know yourself and know your ego better and see where your growing edges are and what you need to work on. So that's it for today. And again, I'll be back next week to talk more about higher consciousness, the higher self. And I wanted you to remember that on Patreon, I have a soul supporter tier if you're interested in that. And I am going to be offering bonuses and reflections and journaling pages and things just for people at that soul supporter level and above. If you're interested in that at all, you can join my Patreon page at patreon.com/EOLU. And or go to eoluniversity.com/support, and you'll find other ways you can make a donation if you feel motivated to. No obligation. Don't even worry about it otherwise. But also share this podcast with other people who you think might enjoy listening. And so until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, which is coming from your ego. Don't forget that. And be ready for whatever life brings you next, because that's going to trigger your ego also. And just love and embrace every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.